So I want to talk about some of the issues that I have with populism. Now, firstly, what is populism? Populism is essentially defined as a belief system where the will of the common man, the common person, essentially representing the middle class, the average person, where the average person is right and the elite are essentially a villainous group of people who are trying to oppress or mislead the common person. Now, what's interesting is that in the past, there was actually a lot of left wing populism, like back in the 2000s, the 90s, like kind of like the era of people like Michael Moore. There was definitely a lot of left wing populism, even like Occupy Wall Street to an extent could be seen as a left wing populist movement. But increasingly, the left have become anti populist and pro elite. And we can see this, for instance, in the fact that like many leftists want to just simply deny people the ability to comment online. Like they want to remove comment sections from news websites or various other websites. They want to de-anonymize social media, force people to use their real names, things like that. Like it's obvious that the left have grown increasingly contemptuous of the average person and defensive of the elite. Like a lot of the left are flat out saying that they like neocon wars now, for instance, and that they just generally support the elite. And they even talk about how Taylor Swift is somehow an oppressed victim because people single out her carbon emissions or whatever. And it's like, while the left have become increasingly pro-elite, the right have become increasingly populist and anti-elite, to the point where they see the elite as being responsible for literally everything bad in society. Again, this is kind of a shifting of perspective because decades ago you could have said the right were actually more pro-elite and the left were more populist. But oh, how the turntables. As people's views become more in line with that of the perceived establishment, they start defending the establishment more. Like the left were perceived as the rebels once upon a time back in the 60s, but now they are the establishment very much. And the right are the ones who see themselves as the rebels against this elite, and also the defenders of the common man. Now, what is my problem with populism? My problem with populism is that it basically ignores the fact that many of society's problems actually do stem from the common man, or at very least, these could be problems that are inflamed by the elite deliberately, but ultimately the elite didn't create them. And I think that's a big issue because, yes, there are certain issues you can actually point to the elite for 100%. Like, for instance, when you look at the kind of like shitty modernist art at places like the Guggenheim Museum, I don't think that's something that the common man ever wanted. I don't think this is something that they've eagerly eaten up. It's something that the elite aggressively promote and that the public range to from indifferent to actively hostile toward. Like, you don't see the average person lining up to go to the Guggenheim Museum and look at all this shitty minimalist artwork. That's just not something that the average person ever really wanted. But conversely, for instance, if you look at something like Transformers movies or Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, I mean, yes, these movies are put out by Hollywood, by the entertainment elite, but at the same time, it's obvious that the masses do to some extent want these kinds of movies, that there is a market for them, and the elite didn't really have to try that hard to push people to go see these movies because people kind of wanted to begin with. And a lot of these movies are just kind of lowest common denominator crap, but people do eat them up. And yes, I know in the last year, Marvel has been underperforming a bit, but A, we don't know that's a long-term trend. They could go back to Marvel. And that's because B, Marvel has just been especially shitty lately. But they were fine with it when it was merely mediocre. Like, they were fine with it when it was crap like Iron Man 2 or Thor 2 or, you know, any given random Marvel movie like the first Captain America movie. Movies that are like range from like good but not great to like mediocre. Whereas to like kind of shitty. Whereas today they're just absolute shit. Like stuff like the Marvels, the Eternals, or Miss Marvel, or fucking Madam Web, or whatever. Like, That's the thing. It's like, okay, I get the argument that it's like people, okay, people, they do have a certain threshold where something is too shitty even for the masses, but they do like a lot of stuff that's just mediocre. Like the first Avengers film was fucking mediocre as hell, and people loved it. Like the MCU has always been kind of about lowest common denominator mediocrity. You know, like the movies as a whole aren't necessarily terrible, but they're just very bland and formulaic. And I think that's the criticism a lot of people have made about the MCU. But the thing is, that is kind of an anti-populist criticism, and I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. Like the masses kind of like mediocrity. They like McDonald's. McDonald's is a perfect example. Their food, it tastes good, but it's kind of mediocre. Like, you know, you're not eating like a really, really delicious hamburger. Like the kinds you would get at many local restaurants, or even at some of the better chains, like say Five Guys, In-N-Out, or Shake Shack, or Culver's. Although even those ones, like I find Five Guys increasingly inconsistent as time goes on. But you know, like I mean, there are better types. Like I would always recommend local restaurants first, because as I've said, that increases the sense of community and character. But my point is, when looking at quality in and of itself, like yes, the masses are often content with mediocrity and often like mediocrity. And they often do like some stuff that's like basically like lowest common denominator schlock. And you can't blame the elite entirely for that, because to a large extent, that is the elite just giving the masses what they want. Again, like the masses, they don't want like this like hyper woke shit. They don't want this like weird like art films like Tree of Life or whatever. Like they don't want in your face wokeness, like all these movies with like that are entirely about feminism or diversity or whatever, like the Marvels. But they do want kind of lowest common denominator mediocrity, like the 2012 Avengers film. And I'm sorry, but like the masses, they don't always have a stellar track record. Like, I mean, look at Blade Runner 2049 was a genuinely great movie, and it flopped at the box office. Like, the masses don't necessarily have a great track record at rewarding quality. And movies is just one example. You can look at all kinds of things, like with architecture. That's another example. Like, yes, I would agree the masses never asked for stuff like, say, the Bilbao Guggenheim or the New York Guggenheim, or like just this like really garish but also very expensive modernist and postmodernist architecture, or like brutalism, for instance. I don't think the masses ever asked for that. Like, these are things that were pushed by a certain part of the elite that is very ideological and kind of hostile and nihilistic. Like, they want to like make people look at like really, really ugly shit, and I think it's part of their ideological belief. It's just sort of like a general contempt for beauty. But at the same time, while the masses might reject that type of modernist architecture, or at least they might be indifferent to it, and yes, studies have shown repeatedly people do prefer traditional architecture to modernist architecture. I don't disagree with that, and it is good. Like, when you look at tourism, for instance, it's obvious that the majority of people do like to look at traditional architecture, or at least, if not a majority, many people do. But here's the thing. Here's the sad truth. When it comes to where people would actually want to live, they like suburbia. Like, I think the vast majority of people prefer suburbia to any other type of living. And frankly, suburbia is the McDonald's of neighborhood types. It's the MCU of neighborhood types. It's just comfortable mediocrity, comfortable, predictable mediocrity. They might like traveling to places like Rome or Amsterdam or Prague, but they don't want to live in a place like that. Where they want to live is a place that's very comfortably mediocre. And again, it's the case with so many things. Like, that's kind of what the masses really want. And you can't necessarily blame the elite for it 100%. Because a lot of these things the masses have eagerly demanded, like be it suburbia, MCU movies, McDonald's, SUVs and pickup trucks, like all these hideous, gigantic vehicles that make it dangerous for pedestrians to go outside and that just are such a fucking waste of money. like the amount of money that people pour into these vehicles, even while claiming to be super poor. And obviously, there's the environmental damage they do, and the fact that they basically make it impossible to design traditional neighborhoods because traditional neighborhoods aren't are designed around people, not cars. But these fucking huge cars take up so much space that they force the entire neighborhood to be designed around them. So again, like, I mean, a lot of this shit is shit that the masses asked for. Same with, frankly, like sexual promiscuity. Like, I mean, that's called the law of the jungle for a reason. Like, essentially, if you take away rules and you simply let the will of the masses be the prevailing norm, you will get the law of the jungle, like sexual anarchy. You will get promiscuity, you will get hypergamy, you will get polyandry, you'll get basically people acting like animals in a sexual sense. And again, you can argue like this is why we created rules. And that's why when we had a better elite, that they would impose these kinds of rules. Like, hey, there are certain sexual norms that people have to abide by. And the removal of these sexual norms, like, yes, the current elite have done that, but I would argue what they're doing is simply allowing the law of the jungle to reign sexually to some extent. I mean, at least it was kind of that way in the 90s and 2000s. Nowadays, there's this like sex negative feminism thing that's come around, which isn't really the law of the jungle, but isn't, I don't know. That's kind of its own beast. But my point is, okay, like, my point is when populists, like a lot of populists, they seem to act like every problem stems from the elites and that if we just let the masses have their way, everything would work good. But it's like, I just don't know if that's true because, I mean, the masses do like a lot of crap. And I mean, we do need to have rules. We do need, again, like populism, it's a bit confusing. Like, is populism synonymous with anarchism? I don't know, because it's like some of the populists do seem to overlap with anarchists. Like, they act like the solution is that we just need to have no elite or no government or like a minimal elite, a minimal government. Whereas there might be others who say, no, we need a new elite, but an elite that reflects the will of the people. Because, like, I guess some of them probably would acknowledge, like, for instance, there's probably a lot of average people who don't like the current sexual norms, but some would say the answer is that we should just have sexual anarchy, whereas others would say, no, we need a better elite that will impose more traditional sexual norms. So again, like, I mean, I guess you can't tar all populists with one brush here, but I do think, though, they do use certain language. Like, for instance, they describe a lot of things as unnatural, and it's like, I don't think it is unnatural. Like, I think sexual promiscuity is very natural. I think polyandry and hypergamy are very natural. I think us imposing monogamy as the norm, as we did for hundreds of years, actually goes against nature, but it's actually a good thing. And it's like sometimes we actually need to overcome our human nature by imposing rules that make us better than our nature. And that's the thing. This is where I disagree with a lot of libertarians, a lot of anarchist types, a lot of populists, a lot of, also frankly, a lot of pagans, is this kind of like worship of human nature. This idea that like our nature is fundamentally good and that if there were no rules, if there were no elite, that we should just let the law of the jungle reign. I disagree with that. I guess I have a more Christian perspective on human nature, which is that I think human nature is heavily flawed, heavily fallen, and we need rules to constrain human nature and to guide us to be better than our nature. Like, I think that's where I disagree with a lot of these populist types. Like, for instance, I do think, like, promiscuity is basically sexual capitalism and monogamy is sexual socialism, and I support sexual socialism. And again, economics is another example. Like, a lot of these populist types are also capitalists, and they believe, like, the market will fix everything. If you just let the free market reign, it will solve everything. I don't think that's a very Christian perspective either. Like, I don't think free market capitalism is very Christian, because if you believe that human nature is fallen, then why would you believe that, like, letting the law of the jungle reign in economics is a good idea? Like, oh, human nature will solve everything, the market will solve everything. It's like, actually, no, it won't. It's like the market just produces endless Avengers movies, endless McDonald's and Starbucks locations. Like, that's what the fucking market produces. It's like, oh, okay, fine. Marvel's not the flavor right now. Okay, it'll produce endless Mario or Barbie movies and their knockoff. I guess that's the new current thing. Whatever. Not much better. If anything, that might be worse than the Avengers movies. So yeah, like, I mean, I'm sorry, but the common man isn't entirely great. The elite are definitely terrible. Like, I don't disagree that the current elite are awful, but I think that much of what they do is inflame passions that already existed in the common man rather than create things entirely new. Like, I think they appeal to our worst nature, but the fact is that worst nature already exists to begin with. They didn't create it out of thin air. I think when they do try to create things out of thin air, like in the case of postmodernist art and postmodernist architecture, all this like hideous, expensive shit, like the Guggenheim, as I mentioned, shit like that, it actually doesn't go over very well. And that's because that's not a case of inflaming bad tendencies that are already within human nature. That's trying to promote something that nobody really liked to begin with, aside from a few elites. That's why it doesn't go over well. Versus when you try to promote a form of crap that is more in line with human nature, like McDonald's, Avengers, MCU, suburban sprawl, SUVs, etc., Taylor Swift, Barbie movie, Mario movie, whatever. Like, all this crap is more reflective of human nature, and that's why it succeeds more, because it does reflect more what the masses want. Kind of stuff that's like lowest common denominator, comfortable mediocrity. And I mean, that's the thing. It's like, I don't think you can blame the elite for every problem, because ultimately a lot of these problems do stem from the common man. I think we need a better elite. I think what we need is an elite that encourages us to transcend our nature and to become better. That's the thing. The current elite does a mix of both things. They push things that are unnatural and that encourage us to become worse. Like, say, the T in the LGBT acronym. Like, the T stuff is definitely something the elite have pushed on us that the masses never really asked for, but is now being pushed aggressively on us. Same with mass immigration and a lot of this stuff. Like, the masses kind of are promoting mass immigration now, but I mean, we didn't used to the same extent. It was pushed on us to begin with. But I mean, we have to understand that not every bad thing is pushed on us by the elite. Like, some of them are just things that the common man kind of wanted to begin with, and the elite are either they're indifferent toward it or they're willing to use it for their agenda, but they didn't necessarily create the desire in the first place. So yeah, like, those are my issues with populism. Like, fundamentally, just because, like, the tyranny of the majority should not be the guiding principle of the land. It shouldn't be the law of the land, like the tyranny of the majority. Like, ultimately, people are sheep and they need a good shepherd to guide them. They don't need to be a flock of sheep without a shepherd. It's just that currently they have a really terrible shepherd guiding them in the form of, the left liberal elite. And I agree, these elites are terrible people who should be dethroned and they should not be in power. But the answer isn't no elite. The answer is we need a better elite than the current one.